70 of Canada's most prominent figures just dropped a bombshell letter on Prime Minister Mark Carney's desk. And it's a digital wake-up call that could reshape Canada's entire relationship with American tech giants. We're talking about Margaret Atwood, former Governor General Adrienne Clarkson, and dozens of experts who are essentially telling Carney, "You're building pipelines while Trump is building digital prison walls around Canada." This isn't just another policy debate. This is about whether Canada will remain a sovereign nation in the digital age or become what one signatory called tenants in Trump's regime. So what exactly are these 70 Canadians so worried about? And why are they saying Carney's missing the biggest threat to Canadian independence since Confederation? To understand this letter, we need to grasp just how completely Canada has surrendered its digital independence to American corporations. The numbers are staggering and frankly terrifying. 90% of Canada's internet traffic currently flows through the United States or through US-based tech giants. Think about that for a moment. Nearly everything Canadians do online, from banking to healthcare records to government communications, passes through American-controlled infrastructure. It's like having all of Canada's roads lead through Washington, D.C., with American toll booths at every intersection. But the dependency goes much deeper than internet traffic. American tech giants, Amazon, Microsoft, Google, Facebook, TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, don't just facilitate Canadian digital life, they control it. These companies make more than $20 billion annually from Canadian digital creators, completely tax-free, while Canadian artists and content producers struggle to compete on platforms designed to favor American interests. Meanwhile, these same platforms shape Canadian political discussions, influence elections, and determine what information Canadians see, all without meaningful Canadian oversight or regulation. The letter's signatories aren't just academic theorists worried about abstract sovereignty concepts. They include some of Canada's most respected voices: best-selling author Margaret Atwood, acclaimed filmmaker Adam Egoyan, former Governor General Adrienne Clarkson, and organizations like the Canadian Civil Liberties Association and the Canadian Medical Associations. When figures of this caliber unite around a single issue, it signals something approaching a national emergency. Barry Appleton, a Toronto-based international trade lawyer who signed the letter, put the stakes in stark terms. Empires once built railways. Now they build algorithms. If Canada cannot govern the code that governs Canadians, then we are no longer a sovereign democracy. We will be tenants in Trump's regime. This isn't hyperbole. It's a recognition that digital infrastructure has become as critical to national sovereignty as physical infrastructure was in the railway age. The timing of this letter is no coincidence. It comes as Mark Carney has spent months positioning himself as the leader who will make Canada an energy superpower and get big projects built. His government has just launched the Major Projects Office from Calgary, focusing on streamlining approval processes for pipelines, railways, and energy corridors across the nation.
Good evening. Canada is done waiting. Done waiting for approval, done waiting for permission, and done waiting for Donald Trump's America. Today, Prime Minister Mark Carney unveiled one of the most ambitious initiatives in Canadian history, the launch of the Major Projects Office, headquartered in Calgary. Far from just another policy announcement, this move signals a declaration that Canada will build, expand, and lead, standing firmly on its own in the global arena. Carney reminded Canadians that theirs has always been a nation of builders, from the St. Lawrence Seaway to Expo 67. Now, in 2025, his message is clear: this generation must do the same. The Building Canada Act, passed in June, cleared away red tape and gave government the tools to fast-track approvals. The new office puts those tools into action, cutting timelines to just 2 years and creating a one-project, one-review system. Beyond approvals, the office will structure financing, pulling in billions from the private sector, provincial partners, and federal programs like the Canada Growth Fund.
This ambitious initiative represents one of the largest infrastructure pushes in Canadian history, with Carney declaring that Canada is done waiting for American approval and will build its own path to prosperity. But while the Prime Minister celebrates physical infrastructure development, the 70 signatories argue he's completely ignored the digital infrastructure that increasingly determines whether Canada remains independent or becomes a digital colony of the United States. The letter warns that under the Trump administration, American control over Canadian digital systems poses unprecedented risks. Trump's team has already demonstrated willingness to weaponize technology for political purposes.
Today, Donald Trump showed no signs of reciprocating. The U.S. president is preparing to defend his global tariff regime before the Supreme Court.
Because without the tariffs, this country is in serious, serious trouble.
To use data as leverage in trade negotiations and to demand that American companies comply with U.S. foreign policy objectives, even when operating in other countries. The former president has even defended his aggressive approach before the Supreme Court, arguing that without his hardline stance, America would be in serious trouble. For Canada, this means that essential services, healthcare systems, financial networks, government communications, even emergency services, could be disrupted or compromised if they depend on American-controlled digital infrastructure. Consider what this means in practice. Canadian hospitals increasingly rely on cloud-based systems hosted by American companies. If tensions escalate between Canada and the United States, could these systems be shut down or access restricted? Canadian banks use American-developed software and data storage systems. Could financial transactions be monitored, delayed, or blocked as part of economic warfare? Canadian government communications flow through American-controlled networks. Could sensitive diplomatic or security information be intercepted or manipulated? The letter doesn't just identify problems, it proposes a comprehensive 14-point action plan to restore Canadian digital sovereignty. The signatories want Carney to launch immediate public consultations with experts and citizens about digital sovereignty threats. They're calling for an independent threat assessment of Canada's digital infrastructure, similar to security assessments conducted for physical infrastructure and military threats. Crucially, the letter demands updates to the Consumer Privacy Protection Act and revival of the Online Harms Act, legislation that died when Justin Trudeau's government fell, but which the Carney administration is considering reviving. However, the signatories warn that the current version of these bills could actually make the problem worse by opening the door to unprecedented surveillance and cross-border data sharing with the U.S. That under President Trump has become increasingly unreliable, authoritarian, and out of step with liberal democracies around the world. The letter also calls for scrapping Bill C-2, the so-called Strong Borders Bill, which critics argue would create new mechanisms for sharing Canadian data with American authorities. Instead, the signatories want cybersecurity legislation specifically designed to protect critical digital systems in federally regulated sectors like banking, transportation, energy, and telecommunications. One of the most significant recommendations involves taxation and economic policy. The letter urges Carney to implement a digital services tax targeting American tech giants who profit from Canadian users while contributing nothing to Canadian public finances. This isn't just about revenue, it's about asserting Canadian authority over companies that operate in Canadian digital space. The signatories also want requirements that Canadian data be stored on Canadian soil, with Canadian-controlled systems subject to Canadian law. The response from Carney's government has been notably tepid. A spokesperson for Minister of Artificial Intelligence and Digital Innovation, Evan Solomon, acknowledged the letter but offered only generic platitudes about wanting trusted digital platforms and protections, while being committed to implementing regulation that is clear without hindering innovation and growth. This non-response suggests the government either doesn't understand the urgency of the threat or is unwilling to confront American tech giants. But the 70 signatories aren't backing down. They're demanding urgent meetings with government officials to begin what they call resetting Canada's digital policies. They argue that digital infrastructure now plays the same role in Canada's economy, society, culture, and politics that physical infrastructure played in previous eras. Just as Canada couldn't remain independent without controlling its railways, ports, and highways, it cannot remain independent without controlling its digital highways. The letter warns that we will be hard-pressed to build Canada strong, let alone to avoid becoming the 51st state, if we surrender more of our digital sovereignty to American tech giants. This reference to Trump's repeated jokes about Canada becoming America's 51st state isn't coincidental. The signatories see digital dependence as a pathway to actual political absorption. The stakes extend beyond abstract sovereignty concerns to immediate practical threats. The letter points out that foreign social media platforms like TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook shape Canadian political discussions without domestic oversight. These platforms use algorithms designed by American companies, operating under American legal frameworks, optimized for American business interests. They can amplify or suppress Canadian political content, influence Canadian elections, and shape Canadian public opinion, all while remaining essentially unaccountable to Canadian democratic institutions. Moreover, the current system creates massive economic inefficiencies. Canadian digital creators generate billions in value for American platforms while receiving only a fraction of the revenue. Canadian businesses depend on American-controlled advertising systems, payment processors, and customer management tools, making them vulnerable to policy changes decided in Silicon Valley boardrooms. Canadian consumers pay American companies for services that could be provided by Canadian firms if the playing field weren't tilted so dramatically in favor of American giants. The letter also addresses artificial intelligence, which represents perhaps the most critical frontier in the digital sovereignty battle. American companies currently dominate AI development, training their systems primarily on American data, optimized for American values and priorities. As AI becomes central to everything from healthcare to education to criminal justice, Canadian dependence on American AI systems could mean that fundamental decisions about Canadian society are made by algorithms designed to serve American interests. The signatories want Canada to develop domestic AI capabilities, support open-source alternatives to proprietary American systems, and ensure that AI systems used in Canada reflect Canadian values and priorities. This isn't about rejecting technology or innovation, it's about ensuring that technological development serves Canadian needs rather than American corporate profits. The international context makes this letter even more significant. Across the globe, countries are recognizing that digital sovereignty has become as important as military or economic sovereignty. The European Union has implemented the Digital Markets Act, Digital Services Act, and AI Act specifically to assert regulatory control over American tech giants. China has built parallel digital systems to reduce dependence on American technology. Even traditional American allies like Australia and the United Kingdom are implementing digital taxes and data localization requirements. Canada, meanwhile, has lagged behind these efforts, often appearing more concerned about maintaining friendly relations with American tech companies than protecting Canadian interests.
Elbows down.
There's no capitulation. Let's be clear. Zero. Never, never. That's not happening. We're trying to match exactly what the Americans have done.
And trade talks are ongoing.
It's a complicated negotiation.
That negotiation will be a central focus as Carney convenes his cabinet in the GTA. Starting tomorrow, the Prime Minister and his front bench will be planning fall priorities, from preparing for the CUSMA review and supporting tariff-impacted sectors to fast-tracking big projects. To that end, today, Internal Trade Minister Chrystia Freeland hosted a...
Despite strong rhetoric from Canadian officials declaring there will be no capitulation to American demands, the reality is that in the digital sphere, Canada has already surrendered much of its sovereignty without a fight. The 70 signatories are essentially arguing that this approach has failed, that American tech giants and the Trump administration interpret Canadian accommodation as weakness and respond by demanding even greater concessions. The letter represents a fundamental challenge to Carney's governing priorities. While the Prime Minister focuses on traditional infrastructure projects, pipelines, railways, energy corridors, the signatories argue that digital infrastructure has become more important to Canadian sovereignty and prosperity. They're not opposing physical infrastructure development, but they're demanding equal attention to digital infrastructure. This creates a potential political problem for Carney. His brand as Prime Minister has been built around being the practical, business-friendly leader who can get big projects built and stand up to Trump on trade issues. But the letter suggests that his focus on traditional economic development is missing the most important sovereignty challenge facing Canada. The timing is also politically significant. Carney won the Liberal leadership and a federal election, largely by positioning himself as the leader who could stand up to Trump's economic threats. But the 70 signatories are essentially arguing that while Carney has focused on defending Canada against Trump's tariffs and trade demands, he's ignored Trump's far more dangerous digital encroachment. The letter's call for public consultations could create additional political complications for Carney. If the government launches the recommended consultations and Canadians learn the full extent of their digital dependence on American systems, public pressure for dramatic action could intensify. But dramatic action, like forcing American tech giants to store Canadian data in Canada or implementing significant digital taxes, would inevitably provoke American retaliation, potentially escalating the very trade tensions Carney has been trying to manage. The 70 signatories seem to anticipate this concern, arguing that accommodation has already failed and that only by asserting digital sovereignty can Canada hope to negotiate from a position of strength. They point to the European Union's experience, where initial American threats of retaliation against digital regulation have largely failed to materialize as European leaders stood firm. Ultimately, this letter represents a test of whether Mark Carney's government understands the nature of 21st century sovereignty. The signatories are arguing that in the digital age, control over data, algorithms, and digital infrastructure matters more than control over physical resources. A country that surrenders digital sovereignty, they warn, cannot remain politically or economically independent, regardless of how many pipelines it builds or how much energy it exports. The question now is whether Carney will respond to this challenge with the same energy he's brought to traditional infrastructure development, or whether he'll continue focusing on 19th century solutions to 21st century problems. The 70 signatories have made their position clear. Canada's digital independence is at stake, and time is running out to act. Whether Canada emerges from the Trump era as a truly sovereign nation, or as what Barry Appleton called tenants in Trump's regime, may depend on how seriously Mark Carney takes this digital wake-up call.